Hello, my name is Aviva, and today I wanted to share with you my almost favorite books from 2021. So there's only a couple of days left of Bookmas. I've been putting out a video every single day for the month of December. And if you're not currently caught up with that, I'll make sure that the playlist is linked down below. But basically, yesterday I did my least favorite books from 2021. And tomorrow I'm doing my favorite books from 2021. So today I thought I would do all of my almost favorite books from 2021. All of the books that didn't make it into my top list, but also didn't deserve to be in my bottom list. And to be honest with you, there are some books that didn't make it into any of these lists. I've read almost 200 books this year, and I've been trying not to overload each of these lists. I've been trying to be somewhat picky, and yet I still have, I'm pretty sure, like 18 books to share with you today. But basically, I'm not very good at making like top 10s or anything like that. So tomorrow's video is going to have a handful of favorites, but these are all of the ones that I was considering putting into that video, but they just didn't make it for one reason or another. So I still absolutely loved every single book that I'm going to be talking about in this video, but not every book could be the top of the year. So these are all of the almost tops. So first up, I have 10 Rules for Faking It by Sophie Sullivan. So I'm pretty sure this was her debut book and was also one of the first books that I read at the beginning of this year, and I remember absolutely loving it. It's basically about this girl who, on the day of her birthday, she walks into her boyfriend having sex with somebody else, and she freaks out. She runs to work to go and tell her best friend who she works with. They both work at this podcast station. She barges into her office and like spews what happened. The only thing is that her friend was in the middle of doing a podcast, so everybody who was listening into her kind of heard about this woman's horrible morning, and then her boss comes in and is like, don't worry, we're going to spin this. You're not in trouble. We're actually going to do a new podcast surrounding your dating life. We're going to set you up with a bunch of guys, and then you're going to come on a podcast and you're going to talk about your dates. And then people are going to get to vote for who they think you should eliminate and who you shouldn't. And then, we're going to narrow it down, and hopefully by the end you'll get a boyfriend. And she's like, well, I'd rather do that than get fired. So let's go for it. And then she ends up spending a lot of time with her boss, who she happens to think hates her because he is very nice to everybody else in the office, but he's very professional with her. So, she doesn't think that he likes her very much. And now they're kind of forced to spend time together so that they could set up this whole podcast thing that they're planning to do. And obviously a romance is going to bloom. So this was a dual POV, and I just remember absolutely loving it. The girl had a bit of anxiety issues, and I personally love reading books with anxiety and stuff like that. So I really enjoy that aspect of this book. And I don't know, for some reason, I just remember really, really loving it. The thing is that it was so long ago, it was almost a year ago, that I'm not sure if it will hold up now, since I've read so many books since then, and my tastes have somewhat changed. But every time I think about this book, I have good feelings. So I have a feeling that it still is as good as I remember it to be, but honestly, I'm not too sure. But yeah. Next, I have The Real Deal by Lauren Blakely. So this is a fake dating book about this girl who kind of hires this guy to come home with her for the weekend so that her parents don't bug her about dating somebody from her small town. She likes where she lives in the city, and she doesn't want to get involved with anybody from the place she grew up in. So she brings home a fake boyfriend instead. And the second that she meets this fake boyfriend, they start role playing with each other just to see if they're going to be able to pull this off in front of her family. And then the entire book, they kept doing that. They kept being very verbally flirtatious and stuff like that. And that's when the whole fake dating thing turned around. It was oh, does he mean what he says, or is he just saying it, because we're fake dating? And I just remember really enjoying the role playing that went on in this book. And I remember blushing the entire time that I read it. And to be honest with you, I have read a lot of steamy books since I read this one. So I don't know if it will live up to the steam remembrance that I have of it. I don't know if that's a word, but you get what I mean. But anyway, I don't know if it will live up to my memory of it. But at the same time, I remember that when I read it, I absolutely loved it, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Next, I have Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. So this is a male-male romance between the President of the United States' son and the Prince of England. And this was really hyped for a really long time. And that is one reason why it took me forever to pick it up. I'm pretty sure it was sitting on my shelves for a couple of months before I finally got around to it. But then when I did, I was very pleasantly surprised because I actually really enjoyed it. I thought originally, though, that it was an enemies to lovers, and we were going to read the whole book and it was going to be their their journey from enemies to lovers, and then we'd get their happily ever after at the end of them actually being together. But it wasn't so much like that. It was more of like, you know, an enemies to lovers in the beginning, and then 3/4 of this book was them actually having a real relationship, and we got to see the ups and downs of how they dealt with that, being as famous as they are. And I thought that was really refreshing. I don't usually see that in books. Usually they only actually get together towards the end of the book, but instead in this book, we actually got to see the journey of their ups and downs in them trying to work out having a relationship, being as famous as they are. So I thoroughly enjoy this book. I definitely understand the hype it gets, and it was one of my almost favorite books of this year. Next, I have The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hong. So this is technically the first book in a companion series, but I only read book 1, and I only plan to read book 1. Even though I thoroughly enjoyed book 1, I just know that I'm not down to read the other ones based off of their synopsis. So I'm considering this one a standalone. But basically, it's about this girl who has very high functioning Asperger's disease, and her life is going really great. She's very wealthy. She has a great job. She's happy in every aspect of her life besides for sex. Because of her thing that she has, she basically has a hard time with people touching her and stuff like that. So she ends up hiring an escort to basically teach her everything she wants to know. And then they're going to somewhat have a relationship. It's going to be somewhat of fake dating, and then it's going to turn into real feelings. And basically it's a really good time. And it was actually much steamier than I expected it to be. I don't know why I didn't think about it, but you know, this girl is hiring an escort to teach her about sex. And yet for some reason, it didn't click in my head that this book was going to be super steamy, but I was very pleasantly surprised by that, and I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I love reading about people who have, like, you know, some sort of anxiety issue or like OCD, something along those lines, and I really liked how it was portrayed in this book. Next, I have Dear Ava by Isla Madam Mills. So first off, I don't understand the cover of this book, because in this book, you were actually following high schoolers, and it wasn't even a very steamy book. So this cover makes absolutely no sense. But besides for it, I actually thoroughly enjoyed the book. You're basically following a dual perspective. There's this girl who at the beginning of the book actually went through a very traumatic sexual assault experience, and she knows that somebody on the football team from her school did it to her, but she doesn't know who it was. And then she ends up going back to school a couple of months later to try and find out who it was, like try to get something out of one of them, sort of thing. And she gets a letter in her locker, like anonymously, of this guy who's like, look, I'm on the football team. I didn't do it to you. I don't know who did it to you, but I want to be there for you because I really like you. And she's like, I don't trust anybody on the football team. Forget about it. And then happens to be you're seeing his point of view too, and they somewhat end up getting close. And it's a very fun story. It is a little bit heavier because of the things that she went through, but honestly, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was much better than I expected it to be. Like, I went into the book not really knowing so much what to expect, and then I was super pleasantly surprised. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was very close to making it to my top list from this year. I just had too many books on that list that some stuff had to get cut, and unfortunately, this was one of them. But it was still an amazing read, and I absolutely loved it. Next up is November 9 by Colleen Hoover. So I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I found Colleen Hoover this year. I've read, I think, 3 of her books so far, and this is the only one that I decided to put on my top lists, like my top favorite, my top almost favorite sort of thing, because I thought that it was very unique. The whole time I was reading it, I seriously didn't know where it was going. I was like very confused the whole time, but in the best way possible. Like, it was more of just like I was left on my toes, and I knew that people were keeping secrets from each other, and I couldn't figure it out until we got to the end, and then I was like, holy crap, like mind blown. And because of that, I thoroughly enjoy this book. You're basically following these 2 people. They meet when they're 19 years old, and they end up having like an amazing day together. Like, they bumped into each other at a restaurant. They spent the whole day together, and then honestly, they really wanted to date each other, except that girl was moving to New York at the end of the day, and they don't really want to do a long distance thing. They're like a little bit too young to get involved and stuff like that. So they decide to make up this thing where every single year on November 9th, they will meet again. And then in between those days, they won't talk at all. So they're not going to have any communication whatsoever. They're not going to be able to look each other up online throughout the entire year. And they just have to trust that the other person is going to show up to the place that they said they'll be on November 9th the next year. So this whole book, you're kind of following them from November 9th to November 9th and seeing their relationship blossom throughout the years. And then, you know, if they're still into each other and they're not dating anybody by the end of like 5 or 6 years when they turn like 25 or something like that, then they will actually be together. So it was a very interesting story. There were some twists that I did not see coming, and because of that, it made it to my almost favorite list of the year. With Colleen Hoover, she's kind of like a hit or miss. She always has a story that kind of feels like very normalish, and then she's gonna throw something in there that's gonna be hard-hitting, you're not gonna see coming sort of thing, and it's just gonna like bring it up a level. And I really enjoy that aspect of her books, but because of that, I just know that not every book that she writes is gonna be for me. But at the same time, I read this one and I really liked it, so it made it on to this list. Next, I have All Roads Lead Here by Mariana Zapata. So if you've been seeing my other videos from this month, then you might know that I have read 3 books by Mariana Zapata this year, and hint, hint to tomorrow, but the other 2 made it onto my top list of this year. But this one I had to cut out because it was my least favorite of all of the 3 that I read. Mariana Zapata is very well known for her slow burn romances, and her books are honestly like the slowest of slow. Like, what is it? 600-700 pages a book, and they literally aren't going to kiss until like the last 100 pages, but yet somehow it's so worth it by the time you get to the end. So anyway, this was the first book that I read by her, and I seriously absolutely loved it. I gave it an easy 5 stars, which was very surprising for me because this was very much like a woman's fiction book. You're kind of following this girl as she just got out of like a 14-year relationship, and she decides to move to this small town in Colorado where she grew up with her mother to try and find herself, see who she is alone without, a partner attached to her all the time and stuff like that. And when she gets there, she meets this guy that she's renting, an apartment from, and like he has a son, and she gets close to the son, she gets close to the dad, and whatever. She ends up having a relationship with this single dad. And the thing is that a lot of this book was very much just like her finding herself. And honestly, it shouldn't have been my favorite book, and yet it somehow was, just because Mariana Zapata just knows how to write a good book. But the thing is that I'm putting this on my almost favorite list because it was my least favorite from her because of that. It was a little bit less heavy on the romance than the other 2 books that I'll be mentioning tomorrow were. And because of that, I just didn't think that this one was as good as, the 2 that are going to be on my top favorites. So this one ended up being on my almost favorite list. Next, I have The Soulmate Equation by Christina Lauren. So this was their new release of the year, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm a huge fan of Christina Lauren. I think they write just like really good, easy to read, quick romances, and I thought this one was a lot of fun. It was kind of like a fake dating-ish sort of book. This girl basically gives in her DNA to this matchmaking site that says that, they're going to set you up with your soulmate based off of your DNA. They're going to find, your perfect match for you, and she ends up getting matched with the owner of the company. They get a 98% match. The only issue is that she actually knows the owner of the company, and they don't really get along very well. So the company ends up deciding to pay her to date him to see if their, science sort of stuff ends up being real or not, because they're about to go public, and it would be really good for publicity if they can get a 98% soulmate match, because they've never gotten a match that ended up being that high before. So she ends up taking the money, she fake dates him, and obviously a romance is actually going to bloom between the 2 of them. So I thought that it was really fun. I actually went into this book with really low expectations because I didn't think that the synopsis and me were going to get along very well. Like, I didn't think that idea was very up my alley, but then I was really pleasantly surprised. I thoroughly enjoyed this book way more than I expected to, and therefore it made it to my almost favorite list of this year. Next, I have Make It Sweet by Kristen Callahan. So this is somewhat of a sports romance, but honestly, it's not very heavy on it. You're basically following 2 characters. The guy is a ex-hockey player. He recently got injured, and he was kind of told that he can't play hockey anymore unless he wants to like possibly die. So he is currently in a really bad mood, trying to figure out his life, see what he wants to do, because honestly, all he really wants to do is play hockey, but he can't. And then you're also following this girl who is a famous actress, and she recently got killed off of her television show. And at the same time, she finds out that her boyfriend is cheating on her. So she is not having a great time, and she decides to take a breather and go away for a little bit. So she goes to like this sanctuary, resort, retreat sort of place for a while. And when she's there, she happens to meet this ex-hockey player because his grandmother owns the place and he is currently, you know, like in that headspace also of trying to figure out his life. So he is like there a lot and like, you know, figuring out his life as well. And basically they're going to bump into each other a lot because they're on this estate together and, you know, there's not a lot of people there. So, you know, they're going to cross paths and then a romance is going to bloom, but they don't really want a romance because they're both trying to figure out their lives. They're not in the right space for it, but they're very attracted to each other, so they can't stay away from each other. And basically, it's just a lot of fun. It was really steamy. It was very angsty, very tension filled. It had a lot of cute scenes. There was like a skinny dipping scene. There was like a couple of other really cute moments. And basically, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. Next, I have Scoring Wilder by R.S. Gray, which is a soccer romance standalone, which I absolutely loved. Honestly, it was very close to making it to my top favorites also, but I had to cut it out for a specific reason, which hopefully I'll try to remember to remind you about tomorrow when I talk about another book, which you might know what I'm talking about already if you've been keeping up with my videos all month. But basically, I loved this book. You're basically following this girl. She is a rookie on her college soccer team, and then there's this guy who is a pro soccer player who ends up coaching her team for the season, and they're going to end up having a romance. So it's like a forbidden romance, and it's a really fun time. They're on the soccer team together, like he's her coach and she's the player, and I absolutely loved it. I feel like I can't even think of anything more to say. Like, that's all you need to know about this book. But basically, it was such a fun time. I thought that the relationship was like built up in a really fun way. It was slightly insta-lusty, but honestly, it didn't bother me, which is saying something because usually insta-lust does bother me. But basically, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I thought there was a lot going on. It was very heavy on the soccer, which I thoroughly enjoyed because I was into, you know, the idea of it being a sports romance, and then it totally pulled through on that end of it. But basically, it was a great time, thoroughly enjoyed it, and unfortunately, it couldn't make it onto my top favorites of this year, but it was very close to it. Next, I have Throttled by Lauren Asher. So this is the first book in the Dirty Air companion series. So it's 4 books where you're following 4 different romances, and all 4 books has a race car driver, a Formula One race car driver as the guy, and then a girl is going to come in and, you know, they're going to have a relationship. So in book 1, you're actually following this guy who had a rival on another team for a while, and then all of a sudden this rival ends up joining his team, and now they have to get along, and they're about to start their tour for the year, and this guy ends up bringing along his little sister, and then he's basically like the original guy is going to have a romance with his rival's little sister. So there's a bit of like forbiddenness in it, and it's a really fun time. I thoroughly enjoyed book 1. I didn't like book 2 as much, but it was still a really fun time. I just didn't like it as much because we originally saw the relationship that was happening in book 2 happen in book 1. And then, you know, so there was a little bit of repetition in book 2, which I'm really not a fan of. So that bothered me a little bit. So we're not talking about book 2 and the series in general because I haven't even read the 3rd and the 4th book yet to know. But basically, book 1, definitely a winner. I also wanted to mention Broken Night by L.J. Shen. So this is actually the 2nd book in a companion series, the All Saints High companion series, which is a collection of 3 books, and it's also a spin-off from the Sinner of Saints series. So I loved the Sinner of Saints series, and then the All Saints High series was a little bit not as good for me, but I did love book 2 enough to mention it in my almost favorite list. So this is basically a childhood best friend to lovers romance, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I was really excited for this romance to happen ever since I read the Sinner of Saints series because we saw a little trickle of it in the endings of all of those books, and then we finally got to this romance, and I thought it was a great time. I don't really have much more to say about it. If you're into childhood best friends to lovers, then I highly recommend picking up this book. You don't really need to read all of the other books that I mentioned to read this one. Like, this is technically a standalone, but I do think it would make it slightly more fun if you did, but you seriously don't have to. It's still a great time as it is, and you won't really be confused if you decide to just like randomly pick this one up out of the blue. I also wanted to share Dirty Letters by V. Keeland and Penelope Ward. So this is a pen pal romance. These two kids got set up as anonymous pen pals when they were really young in school. Their classes kind of like exchanged lists, and they both chose each other off of those lists. They became pen pals, and then they ended up being best friends throughout, all of their school years. And they were like seniors in high school, and then something happened to the girl that kind of made her stop writing him letters. And he was very hurt by this. He's like, "Where did you go? What happened? All of a sudden, I'm not hearing from you." And now it's like 8 years later, and for some reason he decides to send her one more letter of like, "What happened? Why did you disappear? You really hurt me. We were best friends, and I just never heard back from you, and you didn't give me a reason why." And she kind of feels really bad, so she decides to send him one more letter explaining why she disappeared. And then they start exchanging letters again, starting to get to know each other again, and their letters kind of turn steamy and sexual and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden they want to meet in person, and stuff just it takes off from there. So this was such a fun time. Seriously, like all of these books were so freaking good, and I couldn't add everything to my top favorites. So you know what? This one didn't make it into it, but it was very close to it. I thought that this was just a really fun time. It was a really cute romance, and it had a little bit of more of like, a heartwarming sort of vibe to it. And before I end the video, I just have a couple of fantasy books that I wanted to share with you. First up is An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. So this is the first book in a 4-book series. And if you saw my video from yesterday, then you know that book 2, 3, and 4 were on the list of my most disappointing reads of this year. I absolutely loved book 1, but I didn't like the rest of the series. But I still thought that book 1 was so good that it was worth it to put it on this list. I thought that it was such a great beginning to a fantasy series. It had so much that I was looking for, and then even more. Like I was so blown away by book 1, even though I didn't like where the rest of the series went. This book had a dual POV. We were following a romance that was like slowly happening. There was a tournament. It was set up in a school. We were following like a soldier and a slave, and they both lived in this empire, and it was like a crazy world with like a crazy political system, and there was just so much about it that I thought was so intriguing. I remember not wanting to put this book down. I absolutely loved it, and that is one reason why the rest of the series was so much of a disappointment for me, because I didn't like where everything went, even though it started off so freaking well. So I loved book 1, even though I didn't like the rest of it. Next, I wanted to talk about Percy Jackson by Rick Riordan. So I listened to the original 5 books, the middle grade series, on audiobook this year, and I absolutely loved them. I do own all the physical books, but I didn't really want to waste my time reading them physically because they were middle grade, and I wasn't sure if I was going to like connect with the writing style, if it was going to be too young for me. So I chose to listen to them through audio, and oh my God, did I have an amazing time. I have nothing bad to say about this series, and honestly, it probably could have made it into my top favorites of the year. But when I listen to audiobooks, I'm kind of like one level less attached to it, and like I sometimes miss some stuff, and like I don't process it in the same way as if I would have physically read them. So I do think that if I did physically read them, they would have made it to my top favorites. But because I listened to them through audio, I'm pushing it down to my almost favorites because I really wholeheartedly enjoyed the series, but I feel like also I could have enjoyed it even more if I would have physically read them. I also quickly wanted to mention the Heroes of Olympus by Rick Riordan, which is the spin-off series to the original Percy Jackson books. I'm currently only halfway through book 2, but I'm loving it just as much, if not more, than the original Percy books. I wasn't really sure what to think about this series. Like I originally finished the Percy Jackson original middle grades, and then like it took me a while to jump into this spin-off series because I knew that it was going to start off and we weren't going to be mainly following Percy and Annabeth, and I wasn't sure how to feel about it. But then I was pleasantly surprised with where this story continued after, the end of the last book, and then, all the characters that we're meeting and where the story went and everything like that. Like, I'm not sure if this series is better than the others. We're going to have to wait until I finish all of the books and then decide, but I'm having a feeling that this one is going to be even better because I am thoroughly enjoying it. And the last book that I quickly wanted to mention is the first 3 books in the Miss Peregrine series. So I listened to the first 4 books on audio, and if you saw yesterday's video, then you know that book 4 was pretty much a huge disappointment for me, and I actually DNF'd the series after that, but I thoroughly enjoyed the first 3 books. I thought it was such a fun time, such a unique story. I thought that it was done so well, and I seriously have nothing bad to say about it. So I wanted to add the first 3 books to this list. But anyway, that's really all I have to share with you. I know that this was a lot of books. Again, I have a really hard time condensing lists, but I really do think that all of these books were worth a mention of my almost favorites. So I am curious to know if you read any of these books. What did you think about them? Were any of them your favorites from the year? Or do you plan to add any of them to your TBR? Because I do think that all of these were great and they are definitely worth the read. But anyway, I am very excited to share with you my favorite list tomorrow. So make sure that you're subscribed to my channel so that you can get notified when that video gets posted. Also, if you enjoyed watching this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And anyway, thank you so much for watching. And until tomorrow, enjoy reading.